I've got some bad news to report to you today. Racism is on the rise in a big way. In fact, over the last 3 weeks, since the killing of George Floyd, there has been a huge surge in racism. Is there anything we can do about it? I think there is. The first thing you should do when you want to attack a serious problem is to identify it clearly. You want to be able to recognise it and to think about how it came about so you can work out ways to combat it. So the most fundamental question we need to ask right at the start is something pretty simple. What is racism? What is racism? Okay, if you look up dictionary.com, which is a fairly widely used dictionary online, I think it's the top hit, dictionary.com says that racism is a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate others, or that a particular racial group is inferior to others. The second definition is a policy, system of government, etc., based upon or fostering such a doctrine, discrimination. Thirdly, it says hatred or intolerance of another race or other races. The Cambridge Dictionary adds the unfair treatment of someone because of his or her race. So that's sort of pretty broad sort of definition of racism. Now, to be fair, I was just reading recently it's going to be changed. And certainly Merriam-Webster, the definition of racism is actually going to be changed to suit this version of racism that's being portrayed out there at the minute. This idea of systemic racism, this idea that all the oppressors in the world, everyone who's in a position of having privilege earned them by birth, is somehow racist by definition. That would theoretically mean that if you were born in Korea and you were a Korean, then you would by definition be a racist just because of the privileged position you hold by people who aren't Korean, or whatever case it may be, whatever country it is. Now, just to make it clear, I don't believe in races. I don't believe in races. And there is a growing movement that would classify me as racist because I don't believe in races. Okay? But the biblical position is pretty clear, and I've gone through this before, but just so we can see it really clearly, the word race occurs 4 times in the Bible. 4 times. So it's not too hard to do an exhaustive study. Let's turn, if you want, to Psalm 19. Psalm number 19. Let's have a look at races in the Bible. Psalm number 19 and verse number 5. Psalm 19 and verse number 5. It says, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. So the first definition of race we've got in the Bible is what? It's running a race. Running a race. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse number 11. Ecclesiastes chapter number 9 and verse number 11 says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favour to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. What do you say? He saw under the sun, the race is not to the swift. In other words, the fastest person is not necessarily the one who wins the race. You're familiar with the tortoise and hare? Yeah. Okay, so he's saying, guess what? The fastest one is not necessarily going to win it. What sort of race? This is the same sort of race as we saw before. It's a running race. 1 Corinthians chapter number 9. 1 Corinthians chapter number 9 and verse number 24. 1 Corinthians chapter number 9 and verse number 24. 1 Corinthians chapter number 9 and verse number 24. Paul says, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize, so run that ye may obtain. It's pretty clear as well. What are we talking about? A running race. They which run in a race, run all. But run so you receive the prize. Not just run as fast as you can. Try and win. Try and get the prize. That's a running race. And then the last one is Hebrews chapter number 12. Hebrews chapter number 12 and verse number 1. Hebrews chapter number 12 and verse number 1. It says, wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. So in this case, it's a race, but it's kind of like a figurative race. So it's basically like the Christian life, the Christian walk is like a race, is what he's talking about here. Okay? Once again, it's got nothing to do with what people talk about when they say race today, when they say people belong to different races. This is not what this is talking about. In all of these instances, even this one here, which is a figurative race, if you like, it's still talking about running. Now, what the Bible does talk about, other than races, is the Bible talks about nations. It talks about nations. Look, if you go to Acts chapter number 17 and verse number 26. Acts chapter number 17. Acts chapter 17 and verse number 26. Acts chapter 17 and verse 26 says, talking about God, it says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. So notice the Bible says God has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of all the earth. It's pretty clear. We're made of one blood. That's why, if you go to a hospital to get a blood transfusion, they check what blood type you are, but they don't check the colour of the skin of the person who gave the blood that they're going to put into you. Does this match? Because you can have matching colour of the skin, but if you've got the wrong type of blood, because obviously there are different blood types, it's got nothing to do with some made-up thing called race. Turn if you to Revelation chapter number 7. Revelation chapter number 7 and verse number 9. Revelation chapter number 7 and verse number 9. Revelation chapter number 7 and verse number 9. And it says, and after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. And obviously this is the people who came out of great tribulation. This is talking about after the rapture, when people, they're caught up to be with God. That's what this is talking about. But notice where they're from. It says, all nations, kindreds, people, and tongues. Notice there's no mention of races. Now you might say that maybe people is another way of describing a race, but notice that people is separate from kindreds. And obviously kindred, that's referring to being related by common ancestors, isn't it? If someone's your kindred, that means that they're close kin. Okay? Paul writes in Romans, don't you turn there, but in Romans 9 verse 2 he says, for I could wish that myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. In other words, he's saying the people he's related to, the people who were Israelites. Okay? And so, because by and large the Jews weren't saved, by and large they didn't receive Christ, Paul could wish that he were accursed, that he went to hell, so that he could save others, his kindred, people who he loved. But here's the thing. When we're talking about having common ancestors, we've all got common ancestors. We've all got common ancestors. If you look back far enough, guess what? Adam and Eve. There's not a person on the planet that can't go back to Adam and Eve as their direct ancestor. The Bible says that Eve is the mother of all living. We could go back closer to that. We could talk about Noah and his family. Remember Noah, his wife, 3 sons and their 3 wives? Those 8 people on the ark, guess what? Everybody is descended from them. Every single person is descended from them. When God said that he made us of one blood, that means we're all from the same family. You can look at the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter number 1, and you'll actually see that Jesus had people in his ancestry who weren't ethnically Jewish. People at the time, Jesus was Jewish. Well, look at his ancestry that's included in Matthew chapter number 1, and pretty clear, when you go through that genealogy, it's pretty much about men, isn't it? Mostly, but I think there's about 4 women that are included in there, all with sort of various questionable things about why were they included. Well, here's the thing. One of them was a Canaanite, and one of them was a Moabite. So how Jewish exactly was Jesus? Was he pure-blooded? Doesn't sound like it. Oh, of course he really was, because it's one blood. We're all of one blood. Okay? It's an important thing we need to understand. It says actually, look at Romans chapter number 10. Romans chapter 10 and verse number 12. Romans chapter number 10 and verse number 12 says, for there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. There is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. There is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. For the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. Colossians chapter 3 verse 11 says, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision or uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond or free folk, but Christ is all and in all. You see, the Bible talks about, breaking down walls of separation. Because it's true that people do build up walls of separation. We've seen in 1 Corinthians, they're being divided based on what group you think you belong to, whether it's some particular preacher or whatever, but no different but saying, well, I'm of this skin colour, I'm of this group, I'm of this country. And it is a natural human condition. That is true. I mean, people do. What is it, parochialism or whatever. You know, I mean, people support their local team, the local sports team or whatever. That's what humans naturally do. Tribalism or whatever it is. But here's the thing. We are all part of the same human family. We're part of the same human family. I mean, look, the Bible makes it clear. Science agrees with that as well. You know, all the people that say, I don't believe the Bible, guess what? Go to the scientists and said. In 1950, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, issued a statement asserting that all humans belong to the same species and that race is not a biological reality but a myth. That's what they said way back in 1950. This is a summary of the findings of an international panel of anthropologists, geneticists, sociologists and psychologists. A great deal of evidence had accumulated by that time to support this conclusion, and the scientists involved were those who were conducting research and were most knowledgeable about the topic of human variation. Since that time, similar statements have been published by the American Anthropological Association, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, and an enormous amount of modern scientific data has been gathered to justify this conclusion. Today, the vast majority of those involved in research on human variation would agree that biological races do not exist among humans. Now, most people, a lot of people, don't think that. You know, I was reading about this guy who he was studying at university before the first time he heard that. And he's thinking, how come this is not something I learned at school? Why do I have to get to university for someone to say, look, guess what? These anthropologists, they realise, look, we're the same. The critical problem with biological races is the claim that we are all inherently limited or empowered based on our birth into a unique genetic group that contains millions of other similar people. Many good people who champion racial equality and would not be considered racist carry this destructive belief in their heads. So now there's a lot of people who think, yeah, racial equality, it's all good. You know, they're people who you wouldn't think of as being racist, and yet they have this idea that whatever group you're born into, you've got these special attributes that are unique to that group. You've got these special characteristics. But that can't be true because the groups themselves are unnatural, inconsistent, and illogical. The biological race group called black people, for example, makes no sense. It makes no sense because of the deep genetic diversity within it. You can't say, oh, these are black people. I mean, the range of genetics that people have who are labelled as black, you know, you can't say this is one thing because, look, you could take two randomly selected people, two randomly selected black people from Africa, or maybe from the Caribbean, or somewhere else, you know. They are likely to be more distantly related to one another than any one of them is to a typical white European. You think, oh, they must be close to related because of skin colour. Skin colour is such a minor factor. It is such a minor factor. I mean, I read this good illustration I really liked. Someone said, how many oceans are there in the world? How many oceans are there in the world? I think officially there's supposed to be about 5 oceans. You've got the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Southern, and the Arctic. These are the 5 oceans of the world. But how many oceans really are there in the world? There's one. There's only one ocean, isn't there? Now you can give it some name this particular part and this particular part. You know, the sailor's smiling. But here's the thing. the lines between them are arbitrary. You'll find them on a map. But what's that when you're sailing on the high seas? Like, do you notice anything when you cross from one ocean to another? No. There's nothing. There's nothing. And the fish go up to, you know, because I'm a Pacific fish. And so I don't go past there. Is that what happens? Or what about the water? What about the water? All the Pacific water stays here. All the art, you know, that's not what happens. The water goes, guess what it does? It goes everywhere and it mixes everywhere. Yeah. And do you know what happens with people? That's what happens with people. You read in Jesus' genealogy, it happened throughout history. You know, I mean, who did Moses, didn't Moses get hassled because he married an Ethiopian? Yeah. You know, I mean, this idea of these fixed races, it's nonsense. It's complete and utter nonsense. Now, we started the sermon by reading from Exodus 23. Why read from Exodus 23? The title of the sermon today is The Rise of Racism. The Rise of Racism. Racism is on the rise today, and the reasons for it are not obvious to a lot of people. A lot of people don't realise why racism is on the rise. You see, the prevailing view among many people today is that, because the big focus at the minute is America, isn't it? America's the big focus, and ever since that police killing of George Floyd, and things have spread out from there. But this is the big focus, and what they say about America, they say that America has not made much progress on racism. That's what their claim is. You know, that America's always been racist, and it's always going to be. It's just the progress isn't being made. But is that really true? Well, look, at the turn of the 20th century, lynchings occurred at a rate of 3 per week. That's not like that. That's 120 years ago. 3 people per week were lynched. Okay? Well, how often do racially motivated killings of blacks occur today? 1 or 0 per year, on average. That's what there is. That's the average. Now, some years there might be more. You know, there might be debate about when it's racially motivated, when it's not. But it's not, compared to what it used to be, it's nothing even remotely like it. Not only that, even racist attitudes that were commonplace have now become things of the past. There was a Gallup poll that found in 1958, so 1958 is not that long ago, it's not in my living memory, but there's probably some of you, that'd be in your, St. James's memory. Okay, in 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of marriages between blacks and whites. 4%. 1958, that's not that long ago. Only 4% thought it's fine for blacks and whites to get married. That's pretty, you know. So clearly America was a pretty racist. Now, a lot of people aren't really aware of why that is. One of the reasons for this is I won't complicate you and bore you with all sorts of stuff, but historically, you see, there's a big thing. One of the reasons why America is seen as being racist is because of slavery. You know, everyone said, I mean, when I was growing up, I watched Roots. And one of my parents let me watch that when I was a young kid. They let me watch Roots. Okay, which is interesting. Roots, which is actually full of misinformation. It's not true. It was a made-up thing. And a lot of the stuff it says is actually not. But people think it's true. But it's actually not true. Okay? But here's the thing. When people hear about slavery, that's what they think. And they think it's all about people being enslaved because they think of them as being lesser and all these not subhuman and all that sort of stuff. But in actual fact, the whole idea of racism came about long after slavery. Slavery's been around for a long, long time. And the most likely person to enslave black people were black people. And the most likely people to enslave white people were white people. Slavery's been around. And slavery's still around today. Millions of people today are still in slavery. So the people that are really worried about racism, you know, there's still a big task they could do. There's a lot of work they could do because there is real slavery going on. Because that's like the epitome of racism, isn't it? But the fact is that racism, as it was sort of popularised, was kind of after the fact. Because it was like a big push to get rid of slavery. And so people who had slaves came up with justifications for why it was okay. Some of them turned to the Bible to say it's okay. They came up with all these particular reasons, but a common reason that was like, these people, you know, they're lesser. They're lesser people, so that's why they need to stay slave. And that's why a whole pile of writings, people were justifying why slavery was okay. And so the whole different races was invented as a concept. And obviously it took on further life from there and went down the whole, joined in with evolution. Because evolution of racism goes great. That goes really well. That's why some of the biggest proponents, some of the most racist people around, think Adolf Hitler. You know, he believed in evolution. He thought that it's, you know, advancing the fittest species. Get rid of those, you know, get rid of the blacks, get rid of the Jews, get rid of those, you know, subdeveloped. That's what he thought. That he was trying to advance evolution. But the thing about it is, so yeah, back on task. So in America, 1958, 4% of people approved of marriages between blacks. By 2013, that had climbed to 87%. By 2013. So, I mean, it's still, so we're talking about, you know, 7 years ago, there was still 13% of people who thought that wasn't a good thing. Okay? But it's obviously got a lot better, hasn't it? It's got a lot better. In fact, the pollsters said that it was one of the biggest shifts of public opinion in Gallup history. But here's the thing, if things have been improving, if things have been getting better, why don't people realise it? Why don't people realise it? I should have told you to turn back to Exodus, but in Exodus chapter number 23, look at Exodus chapter number 23 and verse number 1. Exodus 23 and verse number 1 says, "Thou shalt not raise a false report. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness." Raising a false report. Raising a false report. The average person believes what they are told by people in authority, or by people who ought to know. When politicians or the media or experts tell us something, it's easier to think it's a fact. Because the experts are telling you, the people in power, the people, the scientists, these people say, it must be true. I read it in the newspaper. I saw it on the TV. It must be true. Look at something as simple as margarine and butter. Now, I know from the Bible that butter is good. Margarine, you won't find it in there. Okay, I know where butter comes from. I know how to make butter. Can't make margarine. Okay? Butter is a creation of God. Margarine is not. But it wasn't that long ago, it was probably 50 years ago or something. Margarine is healthy. Butter's not. Butter's going to give you a heart attack. You don't eat butter, you eat margarine. Now, people believed it. People believed it. And so, people using margarine went up, people using butter went down because they believed it. They believe what they get told. They believe what they get told, even though they're putting cheap, toxic, man-made garbage into themselves. And look at the state of people. I'm not putting it all down to margarine, but, the stuff that people have been feeding themselves is complete and utter garbage. And it's been promoted by the authorities. It's all there to say, this is what you should eat. And people follow what they get told. They follow what they get told. And here's the thing. We get told racism is a big problem. The tendency is to think racism is a big problem. Especially when you see a white policeman killing a black man. But here's the thing. Why are so many people up in arms about that? Why was the thing with George Floyd, why was it such a big deal? Why was it such a big deal? Because people saw it, and they saw it, and they saw it. And it's not that because the video was on YouTube and everyone watched it. And obviously people did watch it, but it's because it was on the news. And it was on again, and again, and again, and again. It was put everywhere. In the same way they convinced people that, margarine is better than butter, guess what? They convinced people that this is a big problem. Now, is it a problem if some guy kills some other unarmed guy unjustly? That's a problem. That's a problem, definitely. There's no doubt about it. But here's the thing. How often does that happen? Compared to a young black man being killed by another black man. Just in the city of Chicago alone. One happens a lot more than the other. And yet, have you seen it? How many black people have you seen being killed? How many headlines have you seen complaining about this, what's happening to our young black people? And understand, as I said at the start, I don't believe in races. So when I say black, when I say white, I'm talking about what average, the world at large says, well, this is a black person, this is a white person. I think it's just nonsense, okay? But how often do we see some person with dark skin in Chicago being killed by someone else? It's happening all the time. It's happening all the time. So why isn't something being done about that? Why isn't something being done about that? Because they don't really care. They don't really care. Black lives matter. Black lives seemingly only matter when it's a white person who kills them. Then black lives matter. But if a black person is killed by a black person, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. People don't care. Why is it? I suppose the reason for the average person is simply because they just don't hear about it. They just don't hear about it. If they heard about it, they would care. There might be marches, there might be protests, there might be, hey, we've got to do something about it. But they don't hear about it. Now, I just want to read you a couple of snippets from two articles from very different points of view, very opposing points of view. The first one says, yes, all white people raised in America are racist. You're white in America, you're racist.
No.
And I think they'd probably say the same thing about in New Zealand as well. You're white, you're in New Zealand, you're racist. It says here, yes, it is a blanket statement or generalisation. No, I'm not going to change that. White people think as individuals. I mean, I don't know how much of this I'm going to be able to read. I don't think I'll be able to read a lot of it. White people think as individuals. So, is this person saying every white person thinks as an individual, and every non-white person, whatever that may be, doesn't think as an individual? Sounds to me like this person is a bigot. Yeah. This person is racist. Because they've looked at the colour of someone's skin and they've said something about them. Yeah. That's the definition of racism. That's what it really is. If I look at your skin and right, I know something about you because you're this shade, because you're that shade, I can tell something about you. It's racism. Yeah. Is it not? He says, look, white people think as individuals, right? Overwhelmingly, we think this way. So this is a white person writing this. And that is problematic when trying to conquer racism. We think, well, I'm not racist because I don't say the N-word and I don't like the KKK, and that we're then exempt from racism. We can sit back and say that racism does not exist anymore because myself and my friends also don't use that word or like the KKK. In doing that, we are disturbingly wrong and atrociously continuing the myth that those two requirements are the only requirements for not involving ourselves in racism. Well, who said that those are the only two requirements? Because I think this person probably doesn't use the N-word, and they probably don't like the KKK, but they're clearly racist. If you think this way, you're wrong. Right. You still are ingrained with very subtle, very casual racism that you are still capable of displaying and exhibiting. Here's what happened. During the era of Jim Crow, we had whites who were running around calling black people coloured and lynching black people and pouring acid in swimming pools with black people and burning down black communities. It was a time of very outward, blatant racism that we displayed, and yes, I say we. This is our history of racial terror in the United States. Us, ours, our grandparents, grandaunts, uncles, cousins, etc., all had a hand in it. Go further up a generation as well to your great ancestors. I don't care. Bottom line is, if your family lived here before 1960, they lived here under Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws took place between 1870 or 1860. So say, look, 1870 and 1960, excuse me. So the Jim Crow laws, just if you're not sure what that is, that's these laws they had where, segregation is what it basically was. Only certain people, you had a library that black people could go to, or a swimming pool that black people could go to versus white people. Only these people could be on the bus. There was a whole thing. It was that lady, the whole thing where she refused to give up her seat. Yeah, Rosa Parks. So that was that whole segregation thing. But here's the thing, and those things were wrong. But do you think everyone agreed with that? Do you think every person believed that? I mean, this person claims that. But what evidence is that's actually true? They say there's no way to trace your ancestry to see if your family had any partaking in Jim Crow, since you have to trace each individual member of your family, and likely, if they did commit any lynchings under Jim Crow, there'd be no record anyways because the law stated they were right in doing so. It's safe to assume, however, that at least one, or likely more, of your family members attended a lynching, saw one, heard about one, etc., and did nothing to stop it, and furthermore did nothing to change the laws. It follows that your family believed that laws of the time stating that black people were 3/5 human, they were all right, fine and dandy. This ideology does not go away over time, it was handed down. So, labelling people by what other people do, is that just? Is that right? Doesn't the Bible say, that the fathers shouldn't be put to death for the children for the fathers? You can't blame. Let's say your dad, well, let's say your granddad. Let's say your granddad was a murderer. Or maybe your grandma was a slave trader. Well, is Is that your fault? Is that your fault? But you weren't even alive. How can it be your fault? So it's madness to blame people for things that they weren't even alive when these things happened. How can that possibly be your fault? That makes about as much sense as it does to say, well, I know something about you because of your skin colour. It makes about that much sense. He goes on and he says, look, you had numerous white families who start telling themselves and their children, it's better just not to see race at all. Well, I agree with that. I think there's nothing, it's a good idea not to see race. White families started raising their children under this ideology, not seeing race. He says it's not a good ideology for a variety of reasons. First, you have the erasure of other people's culture that comes along with it. No, you cannot see race. You cannot see that race has, or the colour, when he's talking about race, he means this colour of people's skin. You can say that the colour of people's skin is not important at all. That doesn't mean you have to erase people's culture and ignore their culture. There are cultural differences. People have cultural differences. It's a good thing. Diversity, it's a good thing. But just because you don't attribute things to people's skin colour, that doesn't mean that does not mean that you're erasing their culture. Because people of the same so-called race can have very different cultures. Can't they? You can be the same race as someone else, supposedly, and yet you can have very different cultures. People can have the same culture and be of different races. Can't they? So it's got nothing to do with each other. And then he says, look, you then expect everyone to follow yours. This is just another manifestation of white supremacy. Okay, so if you teach your children, if you believe and teach your children that, race is not a thing, you shouldn't see colour, you're a white supremacist. It's just madness. White families started telling each other that white supremacists wear white hoods and that as long as you're not wearing a hood or associated with Uncle Brad who does wear one, you're not a white supremacist or supporting white supremacy. I can't read anymore because this person it's just mad. It's just complete. I mean, later on, they even actually own up to saying things like that they used to make house Negro jokes with their family. So it sounds like this person is someone who actually was really racist. And it's like maybe that's why they've got this self-hatred that they're dealing with. This person says that they didn't used to feel this way, but at one time, they finally dropped their defence, they woke up. That's what they said. That's what the cool terminology is, woke. They woke up and realised that all white people in America are racist. It says it again and again, it's in bold. All white people raised in America are racist. It says it 3 times on this page. It's complete madness. They do finish at the end and say, look, you've got 2 options, ignore all of it, continue perpetrating the problems, or see it exactly how it is and fight against it and stand up against it. Well, I agree, we should fight against it and stand up against it. I'll stand up against it and say, this is racist rubbish. That's what it is. And yet this is stuff that's put out there. It's believed. And honestly, I've read a lot of stuff in the last few days from both sides of the camp. I've read stuff from people who really do believe in racial, superiority. People who really do believe that whites are superior. I've read their stuff as well as crazy stuff, like this guy. It's both extremes. I've read it all. And it's frightening to think that people think this way. Here's the thing. Racism is a real thing, not because races are real, but because people think they are. People think that races are real. They do. It's a natural human tendency. They want to categorise things. It's a natural human thing to categorise things, to oversimplify, to approximate. The whole concept that say, well, because someone's got a certain skin colour. Well, look, if you're walking along the street and you see someone, maybe you're in a dark alley. Don't know what you're doing in a dark alley, but maybe you're in an unsavoury part of town. Don't know what you're doing in an unsavoury part of town. But you're walking along and you see someone. The fact is, it's just normal to look at them and you'll make judgments about them. It's just normal, based on what you see. And so here's the thing. In New Zealand, let's go with New Zealand rather than America, since we're in New Zealand. In New Zealand, if you see the person, and if you see that person and you observe, let's say you observe that person looks like a Māori. Okay? That means that the chances of that person belonging to a gang are probably greater than if the person is not Māori. That's true.
Yeah.
If the person is tattooed, then that would probably mean there's a greater chance that person is in a gang than someone who's not tattooed. If that the person's wearing certain sort of apparel, certain sort of clothes, these sort of things add up and you can form that impression. And so it wouldn't be, if you're walking down somewhere and you've got a wallet and you think, I'm not going to be robbed, and you see someone who looks like a shady character, then you might, it might be best to go on the other side of the street, get in the lighter side of the, somewhere where there's people around, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I say, well, look, because James is this colour, or because James has got lots of tattoos, or because James is wearing gang regalia, or whatever it may be, or, yeah, well, exactly. They do wear that. Because of that, therefore, he is, a gang member, a likely criminal. No. Just because you approximate something, because you put things into categories, that's not something you can avoid doing. It's impossible to avoid doing it. But the difference is whether you treat people as individuals or as belonging to a group. That's what it comes down to. Do you treat people as individuals, or do you say, no, the group is more important? And this guy that we read from here, he thinks the group's important. The racist, he thinks that the group's important, as opposed to the individual person. Dave has tattoos. Why has he got tattoos? Because he's a gang member? No, because he used to be in the Navy. In the Navy, everybody had tattoos. So that's why he's got tattoos. And so, we need to understand that, look, profiling people is something that people do. But that doesn't mean that, I suppose, you can't avoid it. When we meet people, have you heard that thing about, in the first 5 seconds, the impression you make? If someone smiles at you, compared to if someone frowns at you. This is a nice person because they smile. This person's frowning. They're nasty people, But your first impressions can be wrong. I've met people before where the first impression I got, I thought, man, this guy's a jerk. This guy's real nasty. And he's one of the nicest people I've ever met. Obviously, he was having a bad day that day. This is the way it was. These things happen. But look, I gave you a bit of that. And I just want to read you a couple of wee things from the other side of the fence. This is something from a guy who is this guy's a history professor at Berkeley. Okay, very liberal university, University of California. And he wrote this letter. He says, and he did it anonymously because he would lose his job if people found out that he thought this. But he said, in your recent departmental emails, he wrote it to sort of other staff members at the RC, you mentioned our pledge to diversity, but I'm increasingly alarmed by the absence of diversity of opinion on the topic of the recent protests and our community response to them. In the extended links and resources you provided, I could not find a single instance of substantial counter-argument or alternative narrative to explain the underrepresentation of black individuals in academia or their over-representation in the criminal justice system. The explanation provided in your documentation, the near exclusion of all others, is univariate. It means it's not allowed for it could be this or this or this. No, it's just this is what it must be. The idea is to say, look, if we say, look, more Maoris are in prison in New Zealand than non-Maoris, therefore the justice system, the prison system, the police are racist. That's why. Because look, if you look at the percentages of Māori versus non-Māori and the percentage in the prison, clearly that must be the case. But are there other possibilities? Are there other possibilities? Could it be because that, Māori are committing more crimes that end up in prison? Percentage-wise? It could be. In fact, I think that is the case. You say, no, that it just shows that there's racism. Okay, well, what about we say the other thing? What about we say, here's something. If the fact that more coloured people are in prison, percentage-wise, than you would expect, shows racism against coloured people, that must mean that the percentage of males in prison compared to females in prison shows sexism. So therefore, if the coloured people are being discriminated against because that's why they're in prison, then surely males are being massively discriminated against. Because, I mean, look, they're filling the prisons, aren't they? I mean, if one's true, but it's not about that, is it? It's not about that at all. It's when people just say, oh, there's A or B. And what about C, D, E, F or G? And what about the other letters you haven't even thought of? He says, look, there are many objections to this thesis have been raised by sober voices, including from within the black community itself. You see, that's something you'll see. These racists claim that a black person can only think certain things. Is it the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, some doddery old senile white guy, says if you don't vote for the Democrats, you're not black. Yeah, I mean, is that not racist or what? Yeah. That's what he said. Yeah. And is the media all over it? No. No, he's a good guy. They hate Trump so much that they'll just anything Joe Biden says, not a problem with it. When these guys here, Thomas Sowell, Wilfred Riley, these people are not racists. They're not Uncle Toms, although people call them that. They're intelligent scholars who reject the narrative that strips black people of agency and systematically externalises the problems of the black community onto outsiders. Their view is entirely absent from the things that were put forward by the University of California, Berkeley. He says, look, if we claim that the criminal justice system is white supremacist, why is it that Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and Nigerian Americans are incarcerated at vastly lower rates than white Americans? If it's all about white supremacy, how come these other guys aren't making it in the prison in great numbers? How come? Strange sort of white supremacy. Even Jewish Americans are incarcerated less than Gentiles. You know that? Guess what? The Jews aren't going to prison as much as the Gentiles. But, white supremacists. Isn't one of the fundamental things about white supremacists, they don't like Jews? Doesn't seem to make sense. He says, none of this is addressed in your literature. None of this is explained beyond hand-waving ad hominems. They say these are racist dog whistles. The model minority myth is white supremacist. Only fascists talk about black-on-black crime. So you mention the fact that a black guy kills a black guy, suddenly you're a fascist. What it is, it's just labelling people. Instead of addressing what they actually say, it's just putting a label on them so you can say, right, we just discount everything they say. You don't have a voice. He says, look, I personally don't dare speak out against the Black Lives Matter narrative. And with this barrage of alleged unity being mass-produced by the administration, this is of the varsity, tenured professoriate in the UC administration, corporate America, the media, the punishment for dissent is a clear danger at a time of widespread economic vulnerability. I'm certain that if my name were attached to this email, I would lose my job and all future jobs, even though I believe in and can justify every word I type. The vast majority of violence visited on the black community is committed by black people. Virtually no marches for these invisible victims, no public silences, no heartfelt letters from the UC regents, deans and departmental heads. The message is clear. Black lives only matter when whites take them. Black violence is expected and insoluble, while white violence requires explanation and demands solution. Please look into your hearts and see how monstrously bigoted this formulation truly is. No discussion is permitted for non-black victims of black violence, who proportionally outnumber black victims of non-black violence. This is especially bitter in the Bay Area, where Asian victimisation by black assailants has reached epidemic proportions, to the point that the San Francisco police chief, has advised Asians to stop hanging good luck charms on their doors as this attracts the attention of overwhelmingly black home invaders. Home invaders like George Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
Here's the thing. This guy, I actually recommend you really read this. It's definitely worth a read. UC Berkeley history professor's open letter against Black Lives Matter, police brutality and cultural orthodoxy. An interesting thing is the guy who wrote it is black.
Oh. Right.
The guy who wrote it is black. Now, it's perfectly logical and perfect. Why? Because why wouldn't he be? Because race doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. Race does not mean... And if you think race means something, then that means you are a racist. If you think the colour of someone's skin is somehow important, other than maybe helping them not get sunburned, it doesn't determine anything. It doesn't determine anything about the quality of someone's character. The fact is, there's very obvious reasons why so many crimes are committed by black people in the United States. The reason is because of things that have been promoted to supposedly help them. The welfare state, which gives money to single mothers, means that you have a huge percentage of fatherless black kids. That's what you have. But guess what? You know, when you have a poor, fatherless white kid living in the same area, he's going to join gangs and he's going to shoot people and that's what happens. That's what happens. But it can become a culture in a particular place. You know, if you look at the stats for all these things, look at the statistics for the murders, look at the statistics for unemployment, look at the statistics for who's married and who's not. Those are the things that are actually really significant. The reason I started in Exodus 23 is because it says, thou shalt not raise a false report. These are false reports that are being raised. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. The next verse is a great one. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. This multitude of people who are, these racist ideas are being promoted and put forth, and people are just blindly following along. It's crazy. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. You see, you go along with the crowd, what everyone's thinking. I mean, doesn't most people believe in races? Most people think it's important, when it's not. It's of no importance whatsoever. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. The Bible says, if thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. In other words, you need to do the right thing, whether you like the guy or not. That's what the Bible says. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and the righteous slay thou not. Stay away from false things, things that aren't true. Don't go slaying the innocent. Don't go condemning people who haven't done anything wrong. What your grandparents or great-grandparents did, it's got nothing to do with you. It's not your fault what they did. You had no control over that. You say, but because of what they did, you had these advantages in life. And because of what these other, what happened to the grandparents of these people, they had these disadvantages in life. That's true. But guess what? Everybody's got advantages and disadvantages. When my parents came to New Zealand, did they have a lot of money? No. They didn't. On the individual level, everybody's got different levels of advantages and disadvantages. Your father's a drunk, you've got a big disadvantage. That's the truth. But does that mean that, all the people whose fathers are not drunk should have a whip round and pay you money? Now, helping out people, that's good. In fact, we'll just mention a quick second before we finish up. There's nothing wrong with helping people. We should help people. But this idea, affirmative action is racist. To say, because of your skin colour, you get to go into this program and you get to, if it's based on skin colour, that's racist. I don't care how you label it. It's racist. Now, if you want to say, hey, look, I think we should build a community centre in this particular poor area, so we want to put a library here, so that people can have access to it. Fantastic. Fantastic. Nothing wrong with that at all. But don't say you're allowed in and you're not. Who are your parents? You know, what colour are you? This whole thing of putting people into groups, into colours, into races, it's just so false. I mean, here's the thing. Are you black if you've got a certain percentage in you? Depends on where you are. I think in the States, and I think it's the same in New Zealand, if you've got a certain percentage, it's like 1/16, or probably even less than that, 1/16 maybe of Māori, then you're a Māori. Well, it doesn't sound like it if you've got 1/16 and a whole pile of other stuff. There are countries where it's not like that. I think I was reading, it might be Haiti. Over there, if you've got a little bit of white in you, you're not black anymore. It's just arbitrary. I'm going to just pick and choose. But it doesn't mean anything anyway. It's all just gobbledygook. Keep thee far from false matter. The innocent righteous slay they not. For I will not justify the wicked. They shall take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Also thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. So when people are coming in from other places, don't oppress someone because they're a foreigner, because they're a stranger, because that's what they were. An interesting thing, this whole thing about systemic racism against black people, you can see that it's not true, because if you have a look at the people who are, say, third generation, descendants of African American slaves, okay, and see how they're doing in life, but then compare them to people who come from, somewhere else, Nigeria. Now, obviously, the person who comes from Nigeria, they're not the average because they're motivated and they come over there, etc., etc. But, then go to their children or their grandchildren. Now, they must have to deal with it because they look the same. They must deal with the same systemic racism. People think, well, you're black, so therefore this happens. And yet, why is it they have such vastly different outcomes? They have better outcomes than the average white person does. Why? Because they come from a family where the person works really hard and encourages education. Married black couples compared to married white couples who have a college education earn more money. Why is that? Because they obviously came from a family that valued hard work and education. Yeah. It's not a surprise. The title of the sermon is The Rise of Racism. There are real racists out there. There's lots of them. Do you know how to recognise them? The way to recognise a racist is someone who attributes characteristics to people based on the colour of their skin. It's that simple. If you're white, that means this. Guess what? That's racist. People say you can't. No, you can't. That's reverse racism. You can't have reverse racism. Okay. Tell that to some of the whites over in South Africa. South Africa had the same apartheid and stuff. It had the segregation. It was a very racist society. Yeah. And what's happened now? Obviously the tables have been flipped. Now it's different people in power and the racism's still there. It's the shoe's on the other foot. Now the people who are being abused by many of them are people who they weren't even born. Someone in their 20s over in South Africa, a white person in their 20s, and they've got to put up with this oppression and discrimination because of their skin colour. Last place we'll turn, Luke chapter number 10. Luke chapter number 10. You see, when people have a sort of a shallow view at things, it ends up causing so many problems. They see something like this George Floyd thing, and they think, we've got to do something. Police brutality. Well, here's the thing. Some policeman, doesn't matter what colour he is, some guy being, killed by the police. It doesn't matter what colour he is. The colour is irrelevant. Justice needs to be done. Get justice for the person who was killed, and justice needs to be done upon the person who did the misdeed. That's what needs to happen. That's what should happen. The law is supposed to be blind. It's supposed to be blind to colour. Now, are there things we can do better? Hey, cameras on cops that are on all the time? That sounds like a great idea. That will protect people and it will protect the cops. Then you'll get an idea, you'll know what happened. Because you can see it should be illegal to have those things too. If you've got the technology, why not have it? But it's not because all the cops are racist. You know, it's a lot more complicated than people realise. A lot more complicated. You know, what about all the black policemen? People say, you know, we just need to have more black policemen. You know? Well, here's the thing. It's interesting. They've done studies. What they found is when you increase the number of black policemen, don't ask me why, but for some reason, when you increase it, it actually ends up producing more police violence. Up to a point, up to about, I think it's about 25%. Once you get up to 25%, then the level of violence stays the same. And then once you get to about 40%, and obviously I think this is talking about in coloured neighbourhoods and stuff, once you get to 40%, then it goes down. Why is that? I don't know. But I don't think, you know, people shouldn't be discriminated against. You can't force people to do something just because we need this. So many times people cause harm when they think they're doing good.
Yeah.
You know, these protests, I mean, so many of these protesters are sincere. They really think, look, we need to help. We need to stop this injustice happening. But you know one of the things that happens is that when this comes out and it becomes so public and everyone's up in arms about it, one thing that happens is that black people are less likely to call the police. Because, I mean, look, you see it on the telly. Police are going to kill you. Police are going to kill you. So if someone breaking into my house, well, am I call the police? What am I going to do? Because they've got that in the back of their mind. Not only that, the police are like, well, I'm not really wanting to hurry into this situation because it's pretty risky. I don't want to just do my job. And obviously it's a dangerous job. It's like being in the armed forces or something. It's a dangerous job to do. And people are going to make mistakes. That's going to happen. But if it's like, when you know, the atmosphere that's out there at the minute, the cop hating, all that stuff that's out there. If you're a cop, what are you going to think? Well, I won't be so quick to respond to this call. I don't really want to get myself in this situation. Isn't that what you think? And that's what they observed. There's a place when was it the Ferguson effect, where there was I can't remember the name of the guy, in a place called Ferguson, and there was a black guy got killed.
Walter Scott.
Okay, oh, you're onto it.
Yep. Walter Scott.
Walter Scott. Okay, so here's the thing. What happened after that was that because of all the stuff that happened, there was more people getting killed because of it. The crime rate went up because the police were like, hands off, let's stay away. I mean, look, defund the police, reduce the police. That's really going to help crime, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's going to be great. Madness. So Luke chapter 10, Luke chapter number 10. It's interesting how often Jesus talked about things that, you know, don't need to turn them, but in John 4, remember he meets the woman at Samaria, the one at the well?
Yeah.
It says, Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. So guess what? The Samaritans, they were like, no, for the Jews. Don't talk to them. Don't have anything to do with the Samaritans. And of course Jesus did. Many times he did. But here in Luke chapter 10, look at the story he told. Luke chapter number 10, and verse number 25. Luke 10 verse 25, he says, And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, with all thy mind, and thy neighbour as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. You say, was Jesus saying you got to keep the commandments to be saved? He says, well, look, if you do that, guess what? You'll be saved. Can you manage that? Can you do that? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, neighbour as yourself. Be perfect. Good luck. Because if you do that, you'll be saved. But this guy looked at the second part of the question, love thy neighbour as thyself. He said unto him, he willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, and who is my neighbour? If I'm supposed to love my neighbour, who is my neighbour? Who am I supposed to look after? Is it the guy that lives next door? Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way. And when they saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the guy who should have helped, what did he do? Just crossed the road, I don't know anything about it. Yeah. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, remember the Samaritans, the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. A certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbour unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, go and do thou likewise. That's the attitude that we should have. It shouldn't make any difference. You know, it shouldn't make any difference. I knocked on the door of someone today, answered the door, and it was what people would call a black lady. What would you do? Is the gospel any different from her? No. I mean, hey, into the whole stereotypical, black people are more receptive to the gospel. The people that I've talked to in Dunedin. You know, there's many countries filled with black people where they're very open to the gospel. They love the Bible. They love God. You know, she said, we made her day. But is she more valuable because of the colour of her skin? Is she less valuable because of the colour of her skin? Or does the colour of her skin have nothing to do with anything? The Bible says God is made of one blood. We're all made of one blood. The people out there marching and demonstrating, the people burning buildings down, the people looting, the people peacefully protesting, the policemen, the people lying on the ground, they're all made of one blood. Yes. They're all made of one blood. It's just a family fight. It's a family fight is what it is. We just need to pray. We need to pray for peace, and we need to pray for sanity. And we need to pray that people would turn to the truth. Let's pray. Gracious Lord, we thank you for your word, and Lord, it is a sad thing that racism is on the rise. Help us to have no part of that. Help us to stand up against it. But not just to stand up against one side of racism, but to stand up against both sides of it. Stand up against all labelling people and treating them differently based on their colour or based on what country they come from. Lord, your word says that you love the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they're precious in your sight, Lord. Help us to have that attitude and help us to bring the good news of the gospel. Help us to bring peace. Help us to bring reconciliation. We thank you and praise you and love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.